Chapter 15. Saturday morning dragged. Andrew blamed the slow clock on the fact that he spent most of the time after breakfast focused on numbers on his computer screen. Chet had sent, via snail mail no less, another accounting notebook, and Andrew had spent the morning adding the contents to his software program, only to discover that, once again, Chet hadn't given him everything Andrew had asked for. Even Cheddar Chet wasn't that stupid, which meant he was hiding something. His own incompetence, or was there more to it? Without all the information, Andrew couldn't be sure. He planned to confront, or at least encourage, his half-brother at the party that afternoon. If he had anything to say about it, he'd bring the remaining books home with him. Dressed in a pair of jeans and a sweater Mom had once told him made him look dashing, he was just about to cross the street when his phone dinged. Praying it wasn't Grace canceling, he glanced at the screen. His friend had gotten a hit on the image of Lily. He clicked the message, and the screen filled with a black and white photograph showing a woman holding a toddler's hand. David's message read, "My software thinks this is your girl. How sure? Where'd it come from?" David said. "Software's really good, but it's no guarantee. Still getting the details. Get back to you soon." Andrew enlarged the photo and gazed at the little girl's face. She looked to be 2, maybe 3, but even still, he could see Lily in those big eyes. And the woman holding her hand had to be related. Her mother, or possibly her sister, since she looked so young. It wasn't the kind of image he was looking for, but maybe it was a link to the child's past, a link to her mother, or at least her family. He grabbed his things and jogged across the parking lot. If his heart was racing a little more than normal, he'd blame the short run and the photograph, not the eagerness to see his neighbor again. He rang the new video doorbell. He'd installed it and the one at the back door the day before, so that the next time Grace thought she had an intruder, she could simply check the app. It was Lily who answered, her eyes teary. "Mr. Middleton, can I bring my dog, please? I forgot to ask, but I don't want to leave him home alone all day long. Miss Grace said no, but I said you would let me, 'cause you're nice." "Lily!" Grace's voice held more than a hint of rebuke as she approached from the kitchen. "That is impolite." She stood beside the child and addressed Andrew. "She'll survive without Regis for the afternoon." To Lily, she said, "And we know Mr. Middleton is nice already, even if you can't take your dog, right?" The child nodded, big green eyes filling with tears. "Sorry, I didn't mean to be mean." Oh man, he'd walked in on something. "It's okay, sweetie. Can I talk to Miss Grace for a second?" Grace said, "Go to the bathroom so we won't have to stop on the way, and get your shoes on." After Lily ran upstairs, Grace stepped back. "We're almost ready. Sorry about that. I don't think she meant it the way it sounded." "As if you didn't think I was nice?" Andrew smiled to show he was kidding. "Or she didn't think you were." "Either, both. I don't know." He joined her inside, and as his eyes adjusted to the dimmer light after the sunshine outside, he took in her appearance. She wore dress slacks and a pale blue off-the-shoulder top that brightened her gray-blue eyes. She'd curled her hair and even put on makeup. He'd already thought her attractive, but wow. Wow. He cleared his throat. "You look beautiful." "Oh." Her cheeks pinked just a touch. "You said it was a date, so..." She lifted her shoulders, dropped them. "Too much? You look perfect." He lowered his voice. "I was planning on taking Regis, but if you said no, and you want to stick with that answer, you don't have to. I don't mind. I know the dog's important, and the party will be mostly outdoors." Regis, seated at their feet, looked between them as if he understood every word. "He makes her feel safe. Though," she chewed her lip, glancing up the stairs, "lately she hasn't relied on him as much. I think you make her feel safe, and she feels at home here. That's a good sign. But today she'll be in a new situation. New people. New experiences. I don't mind, really. I can drive if you're worried about your car. Leather seats are easy to clean. Will Oliver get his feelings hurt?" That earned a laugh, which had been Andrew's goal. "He'll enjoy having the house to himself." Grace stepped toward the stairs. "Let me just... Hold on. I want to show you something." He opened the photograph on his phone and showed her. "David thinks this is her." Grace took the phone and studied the image. Oh my gosh, I think so. She looked up. What do you think? Definitely possible. Grace returned her focus to the image. It's some sort of fair or festival. He'd mostly noticed the people, but now he saw what she meant. Booths were lined up on one side of the photograph. A Ferris wheel rose in the background. The landscape looks flat and treeless. Doesn't look like Washington. I wonder, could it be Texas? He stepped close and looked, trying to think about the image, and not about the floral scent that told him Grace had even put on perfume. Could be. Why would you? I'm ready. Lily hurried down the stairs. Grace handed him back the phone. Mr. Middleton said you can take Regis. The child's eyes lit up, and Andrew felt about 10 feet tall. With that, all females were so easy to please. Andrew followed as his stepmom gave Grace the grand tour of the house. Not that Andrew knew Grace that well, but he guessed she wasn't terribly impressed, even as she oohed and ahed and praised Christine's decorating skills and taste. She might not have been bowled over by the house, but Andrew was bowled over by her. When they'd arrived, she'd conversed comfortably with people she'd never met, shaking hands through a pair of camel-colored leather gloves, while gently handling Lily's incessant, "Can I go play now?" "Please, Miss Grace." Grace had handled their first hour at Dad's party with, well, Grace. She was well named. Lily had made fast friends with Andrew's nephews and was outside bouncing in the big blow-up contraption. Before she'd walked away, Grace had instructed her repeatedly to be careful of her broken arm, not only for her sake but that of others. You don't want to hurt anyone, and you need to stay close. Don't run off into the woods and stay away from that pool. Grace seemed reluctant to leave Lily until Christine pointed out the teenagers she'd hired to babysit for the afternoon. Andrew had introduced Grace to both of his half-sisters and his brother-in-law, and of course the nephews. He and Grace had greeted old family friends Andrew had known as long as he could remember. He'd been looking for his father among the 100 or so guests when Christine had cornered them and offered to take Grace on the tour, because of course, in her mind, everybody would want to see her house. To be fair, it was rather impressive. 6 bedrooms and 7 baths, not including those in the guest house. The place stood alone on 5 acres, tucked into gorgeous New Hampshire woods, which had exploded in color that week, as if even nature bent to Dad's will. The grounds were perfectly manicured. Bright yellow mums lined the beds and surrounded the ridiculous spitting cherub fountain in the middle of a perfectly trimmed circle of hedges. Ostentatious much? But Christine loved it, and she wasn't stingy with her home, opening it not only for business associates and friends but sometimes for people who found themselves without housing. Students needing a place to stay had lived in the guest room in the south wing. Yes, his father's house had wings. A missionary family had stayed in the pool house for a year while they regrouped after being booted from some third world country. His father and stepmom were good people. They hadn't started out that way, but they'd grown and changed in the years since Dad left Mom. Andrew should be less judgmental, but the fact that Grace wasn't dazzled by the wealth made him like her a little bit more. Finally finished with the tour, they just stepped onto the back porch when his father's booming voice reached them. "Been wondering when you'd get here." "Been here for an hour, Dad." Andrew paired the words with a smile as he approached his father and shook his hand. Dad introduced him to the men orbiting around him like moons. Andrew greeted each, then backed up and urged Grace forward with a tap to the small of her back. "This is Grace Miller. Grace, my father, Drew Middleton." At some point, she'd put on her gloves and reached out to shake his hand. "Pleasure to meet you," she said. "Your wife just gave me a tour. What a lovely home." "Thank you, thank you." Andrew shifted to the man beside his father. "Grace, this is Harrison Ackerman, CFO of Middleton Enterprises." "And surrogate uncle," Harrison added as he reached to shake Grace's hand. Harrison clasped Andrew on the shoulder. "Known this fellow since he was in those footed pajamas. Too big for those now, I guess." "I'm sure he was adorable." Grace's eyes twinkled as she regarded Andrew. "I'm too old for those now, too," Andrew said. "Haven't worn them in months." Harrison threw his head back and laughed. It wasn't that funny. "And how do you two know each other?" Dad addressed Grace, but Andrew answered, "Grace is a neighbor. She just moved to Coventry." "What made you move all the way up there? Too cold for my taste and so far from the action." Around him, the other men nodded and muttered their agreement. "I love it," she said. It's the perfect location, and Andrew's been so friendly both to me and Lily. His eyebrows lifted. Lily is my foster daughter, Grace pointed across the yard. She's chasing one of your grandsons. Dad gave her a cursory glance. Cute, cute. He focused on Andrew. Don't leave before we get a chance to talk, eh? Of course. Andrew tapped Grace's back. Let's go check on her. After see you later murmurs, Andrew urged Grace toward the yard where the kids played. Nothing like being put on the spot in front of an audience, huh? He seems nice enough, your dad. They were nearing the screaming children when Andrew leaned in close. You're wearing gloves. It's kind of chilly. It was in the 60s. Not that chilly. He gave her a look, and she shrugged. It's the hand thing. Germophobic? She'd implied her issue with hand-holding was something that needed to be explained, and fear of germs wasn't exactly complex. That's not it. Since you're wearing the gloves, do you mind? He held out his hand, palm up, and she slid hers into his. He'd prefer skin to skin, but skin to soft leather would do. For now. They reached the yard and greeted his sister and other adults standing nearby, chatting and watching the children. He nodded to one of the many cafe tables placed all over the backyard for the occasion. Want to sit? She did, and he took the chair across from her. Regis, who'd been standing guard at the edge of the grass, came and sat by their feet. Andrew patted its head. This is the most well-behaved dog I've ever met. I know, right? And completely devoted to Lily. The first few days she went to school, he sat at the door all day long. His whining made me crazy. She smiled at the little animal. I've never been much of a dog person, but Regis is winning me over. How does a person not like dogs? I like them, just never had one. They always seem like a lot of work. They are a lot of work. This from a woman who takes in foster children. He leaned forward, keeping his voice low. Can I ask you a question? Sure. You don't seem particularly impressed by all of this. She gazed around at the yard, the pool, the crowd, skimming over the 3-story house they'd just toured. That wasn't a question. He held her eye contact and waited. My stepfather was wealthy. Maybe not this wealthy, but he had money. You aren't a fan of your stepfather. With her lips pressed closed, she shook her head. I assume there's a story there. And then a moment passed, and he feared she wouldn't say anything else. Finally, facing the yard, she spoke. My mother fell in love with his money. Maybe him too. I don't know, but definitely his money. I knew. It's hard to explain because I was just a child, but I knew he wasn't a good guy. I told Mom, but she thought I was scared or jealous or... Grace shook her head. She married him anyway. And were you right? Was he not a good guy? He was not. In what way? She turned to meet Andrew's eyes. Mom fell in love with his money. He fell in, not love, but something much darker, with me. Oh. He sat back, tried to process that, tried to figure out how to phrase his next question, but Grace continued without his having to ask. I could feel it, his interest. For years, I could feel his eyes on me. He never said or did anything inappropriate, but it's hard to explain. Okay. He leaned toward her, wanting to know the rest but not daring to ask. All around them, the sounds of the party continued. Children laughing, people chatting, music playing. But all he cared about in that moment was the woman who trusted him enough to share this dark memory. He was always kind to me, Grace said. He bought me things. He took me places. He let me have sleepovers with my girlfriends. By all accounts, he was a good father, but I never trusted him. Andrew wanted to ask how she knew. There must have been hints, looks, something in his behavior. If she picked up on it as a child, how did her mother miss it? They'd been married 4 years when I turned 13, Grace said. It was not long after that birthday that he tried to touch me the first time. He came into my room at night. I pretended I didn't know what he was doing and managed to slip by him, going to my mom. I didn't tell her right away because he was there. I just asked if I could sleep on her floor, told her I'd had a bad dream. Grace's shoulders lifted and fell. I was afraid, but the next day when he was at work, I told her exactly what happened. Good for you. Grace's closed-lipped smile was far from amused. She called me a liar. Seriously? He tried to imagine that. What kind of mother wouldn't at least investigate, at least consider that she might be wrong? Her own daughter was at risk, and the woman, what? Didn't care? Did he have some power over her? Was he abusive or... It was nothing like that. He just held the purse strings. Mom had signed a prenup, so if she left him, she'd have nothing. And I don't think she could face that again. Even though I asked her not to, Mom told my stepdad what I'd said. The next time, he was bolder. He said my mother would never believe me, so why not give in to it? You might even enjoy it, he said. What a pig! Grace nodded slightly. I screamed. Mom came running. He explained away his presence in my room by saying he'd heard me cry out, suggested I needed counseling, and even offered to pay for it. Grace delivered the words almost mechanically. She'd shared this story before. Still, that she would share it with him meant something. He thought I was trapped, Grace said, but I was smart. Mom went out for a girls' night. He wasn't supposed to be home, but I had a feeling he'd come home early. I found our old video camera. When he came into my room that night, I caught the whole thing on film. Good thinking, but he dared not ask the question. I also had a knife, she said, and I wasn't afraid to use it. With the camera, I knew that if I defended myself, the whole thing would be on video. I waited just long enough so that there would be no doubt about what he was trying to do, and then I pulled it out and threatened him. He laughed, but he backed off, told me it was just a matter of time. Andrew tried to imagine 13-year-old Grace wielding a knife against a grown man. The image made his stomach drop. He could have really hurt her. Andrew didn't want to think about what that man could have done to her. So you proved to your mom you were telling the truth. I'm sure that was tough on your relationship, but... His words trailed when Grace shook her head. She accused me of trying to destroy her marriage and sent me away. At 13? Are you serious? I went to live at the girls' home, which is where I met Cassidy. My stepdad was furious, Grace said. With Mom. With me. He wanted me in his house. When I was packing, I heard them arguing. He threatened to leave her if she sent me away. But the prenup only protected him if she left, not if he did the leaving. And deep down, Mom knew the truth. She knew, but she was weak. So she found a safe space for me and left me there. I'm sorry. Andrew wished he knew better words, healing words. He wished he could go back in time and fix it for her. I'm so sorry you had to deal with that. I'm sorry your mother didn't understand your value. How all the gold in the world pales in comparison. Grace's lips stretched into an almost smile. You're a sweet talker, Andrew Middleton. He shook his head, not allowing even a hint of amusement to Grace's face. Not pretty words, true words. Of you, of Lily. We're all worth so much more than any bank account. Her gaze bored into him. After a minute, she dipped her head, seemingly satisfied with what she'd seen. Money doesn't mean to me what it means to most. My stepfather died a couple of years ago, and I inherited half of his fortune. I don't know why he left it to me. Guilt, maybe. She shrugged. So, to answer the question you didn't ask earlier, no, I'm not impressed with wealth. To be honest, wealth makes me nervous. Men with money to burn often do so in unsavory ways. True of women, too, I think. My mother's an example of that. The things people do for and with money, I want no part of it. Then she gazed around again. I don't mean to imply anything about your father. I'm sure he's a good man. I know money doesn't make people evil. You have it, I have it. Some people use it for good. Wealth just makes me wary. I understand that. He wanted to take her hand, but she'd slipped off the gloves. Instead, he rested his palm against her forearm, lying on the table between them. They watched the kids for a little while, Andrew's mind swirling with what Grace had told him. Because Grace had every reason in the world not to trust men, and yet for some reason, she'd trusted him. He didn't know why she'd deemed him worthy, but he vowed he'd never do anything to break that trust.
Chapter 16. Seated on the back patio near one of the many oversized propane heaters, Grace, Andrew, and Lily were finishing up their dinners. Lily'd eaten an entire hot dog, a handful of potato chips, and enough carrot and celery sticks to make Grace feel like a halfway decent parental figure. Is there gonna be cake? I love cake. Before Grace could answer, Andrew said, If I know my father, there will be a giant cake, probably chocolate. Yay! Her voice was too loud, and Grace shushed her. In a slightly lower tone, she added, Chocolate is my favorite. Andrew, unfazed by the child's volume, asked, What kind of cake did your friend have last night? The question had Lily talking about the birthday party, the cake, the magician, and all the presents. Andrew, kind and gentle soul that he was, kept his attention riveted to Lily as if she were the most interesting guest in attendance. Pretty impressive, considering the crowd of adults all around them. That day, Grace had met doctors, hospital department heads, business owners, bankers, and real estate moguls, not to mention a congressman and the governor. Apparently, Drew Middleton's birthday celebration was a very big deal. Yet there was Andrew, conversing with an 8-year-old girl and seeming to enjoy every second of it. Grace hadn't planned to tell him about her stepfather, but at the time, confiding in him had seemed like the most natural thing in the world. She wasn't one to trust easily, especially men. Living at, and then working in, the girl's home, she'd heard many stories and seen many images of evil men, and to be fair, some evil women as well. The old adage that broken people break people had proved true over and over. For years, Grace had dedicated her life to healing the broken. She'd thought she was done with that forever. But here she was, risking everything for a child again. If anything happened to Lily, she wouldn't be the only broken one. Grace wouldn't be able to put her pieces back together again. She mentally shook herself. It wasn't her job to put herself or anybody else back together. God was the creator and recreator, not Grace. A man approached the table. Andrew looked up, and the expression that crossed his features was nowhere near the easy smile he'd worn most of the day. He stood. Chet? Wondered where you were? Been here all day. Haven't seen you, though. Been inside watching the Boston College Wake Forest game? BC win? Andrew voiced the question, though it sounded more forced polite than interested. Chet just shrugged. Wasn't their best game. He held out his hand to Grace, and dread filled her stomach. Why hadn't she kept the gloves on? Andrew leaned in and whispered, You don't have to. But she could do this. For years, she'd shaken hands. At one point, she'd learned to use the impressions she got to her advantage. She'd learned to keep them from affecting her too deeply. When she'd holed herself up in that cottage, she'd lost those skills. If she wanted to rejoin society, she'd need to relearn them. Grace Miller. She slipped her palm against Chet's. No pictures, just strong, dark feelings of loathing and fear. She snatched her hand back and made her lips slip into a smile. This is my brother, Andrew said. Chet Middleton. Chet appraised her head to toe. Where'd he find you? The classifieds? The man added a laugh. Watch yourself, cheese nip. Andrew's low tone held an unspoken threat. Chet glared at him a moment, then turned to Grace and bent at the waist in an almost bow. Forgive me. He exhaled the stench of beer. It's just so rare to find Andrew with a woman. I meant no offense. He'd meant plenty of offense. She didn't bother to respond. The silence, surrounded by partygoers, felt oppressive. Andrew broke it with, Did you bring the information? Chet stepped back. It's a party. Just tell me where it is, and I'll grab it. I'm having a hard time getting my hands on it. Andrew stepped closer to his brother. Are you telling me you can't find it? It'll turn up. There's this thing we learned in business school, Andrew said. I understand you didn't get your MBA, but I'm sure they at least touched on it where you went. Where was that again? Chet leaned back as if Andrew had landed a blow, and Andrew smiled. At that moment, she wasn't impressed with either man. Anyway, Andrew said, it's a pretty simple concept. It's called filing. It's especially helpful to people who can't be bothered to enter their records into software. I mean, if the only accounting records you have are in 70s-era notebooks, the least you can do is keep up with said notebooks. I don't need you to lecture me. Andrew continued, as if he hadn't spoken. The way it works is, you put the notebooks and files in a big box thing we call a filing cabinet, and you use a certain order. Sometimes you might file things alphabetically. That means by your ABCs. Dark red crept up Chet's neck. His eyes narrowed, and fury wafted off of him stronger than the scent of alcohol. In the case of accounting notebooks, Andrew continued, you'd file them chronologically. That means by date. You know, January, February. I know these! Lily popped up from her seat at the table and recited the rest of the months. Andrew seemed genuinely surprised to see the child there. He smiled, waiting patiently for her to finish. When she did, he turned back to Chet. Maybe you should be taking notes. Chet stepped closer to Andrew, getting in his face. Maybe you should shut up. His voice was too loud, and people turned their direction. Maybe you should shove those notebooks right. Watch it, Andrew said. There are children present. Chet glared. That's it. Hide behind a 6-year-old. Lily said, I'm 8. Grace took the girl's wrist and shifted to stand between the men and the child. The murmurs of the crowd died down as people watched to see what would happen next. Grace slid her other hand into the crook of Andrew's elbow and squeezed. That's enough, Andrew. This is a party. He glanced her way, then shook his head and took a step back. Andrew's dad made his way through the crowd and approached. You two okay? His voice held amusement, but she guessed it was forced. These two and their rivalry. He laughed as one hand came down hard on Andrew's shoulder. He addressed the crowd. The desserts are ready. You won't want to miss the apple pie. Slowly, people resumed their conversations, giving the Middleton men some space. Grace wanted nothing more than to walk away, but the tense muscles below her fingers told her Andrew hadn't relaxed one bit. She bent and spoke to Lily. Why don't you go see what they have for dessert? You can choose one thing. I'll get it for you when I'm done here. The child's eyes were wide, flicking between the two men. It's okay, Grace said. We'll be right there. Lily skipped away. When she was gone, Drew addressed his sons. What's going on? He's being his normal, arrogant, know-it-all self, Chet said. Andrew turned away from his brother and addressed his dad. I need to get the rest of the information to do the work you asked me to do. Apparently, he's misplaced some accounting notebooks. I haven't misplaced them, Chet murmured. Barely taking his attention from them, Drew called, Alice! The 60-something woman must have been hovering just beyond Grace's field of vision. When she stepped to Drew's side, he said, Have somebody run to the office to get the NBC books for... He focused on Andrew. When exactly? 3rd quarter last year through 1st quarter this year. She nodded and walked away. There, Drew eyed both of his sons. You two happy now? Andrew dipped his head toward his father. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to. Chet swiveled and marched away. Drew watched him go, shaking his heat. I wish you'd make a little more of an effort. Andrew's lips twitched, and she could almost hear the unspoken, he started it. But he managed to keep the words in his head. You're right, I'll try. His father got pulled into a conversation and left them alone. Andrew met Grace's eyes. Sorry. He looked embarrassed as he nodded at the chair. Should we? Let's not. She wandered out of the crowd. Let's check on Lily. After they finished their desserts, Andrew led the way to the edge of the grassy area, where the kids were twirling sparklers in the gathering darkness. Lily seemed to be having a blast. I take it there's a story there, Grace prompted. Dad asked me to look at the books for the division Chet manages, but Chet has refused to turn them all over. His excuses have shifted every time I've called him on it. First, he said he'd forgotten to include a couple. Then it was his assistant's fault for not getting everything together. Now, apparently, he can't find them. Even Chet's not stupid enough to misplace the books. When he didn't explain any more, she said, I think the story goes back further than that. Andrew watched the children. Picked up on that, did you? He blew out a long breath. I don't think I've ever forgiven him for being born." She shifted, but with their backs to the light, she couldn't make out the expression on his face. "Which is stupid. It's not his fault." A long pause was followed by his low voice. "He was born 6 months after my parents separated. Their divorce wasn't even final yet." "Oh, that's rough." He shrugged. Dad probably would have left Mom for Christine anyway, eventually. I guess they'd been together a while, but Chet was the tipping point. "You're right. That is stupid." His eyebrows rose. "Wow. Thanks for your support." He looked back at the kids. "In my defense, I have tried to not hate him, but he's eminently hateable." Recalling the words Chet had spoken to her and the feelings she'd had when he'd touched her hand, she understood what Andrew meant. Not really an excuse, though. He can be a jerk all he wants. You don't have to be one. I'm usually more self-controlled around him. He reached for Grace's hand, but didn't make contact before he let his arm drop again. "When he looked at you like he did, and then said that to you, I actually felt pretty proud of myself for not punching him." She managed a little laugh. "I think maybe you need to raise the bar on your own behavioral standards." "Only with Cheddar Chet." She let her expression ask the question, and he laughed. "Immature, I know. But Chet, doesn't it sound like something you'd store in your pantry?" That explained the cheese nip comment. Andrew slipped his hand around her waist. "You're right about all of it. I'm glad you were here. I hate to think what words would have slipped out if you and Lily hadn't been listening. You make me want to raise my standards." She leaned against his side, enjoying the warmth and the connection. Maybe Andrew wasn't perfect, but he was a good man, a kind man, a man she could let herself fall for. No, she needed to keep Lily's situation, her needs, and her protection at the forefront. Grace couldn't let Andrew become a distraction. They'd been casually chatting when Andrew grabbed his cell and glanced at the screen. "It's David, the picture guy." After swiping to connect, he said, "What did you learn?" While he listened to his friend, Grace's nerves ratcheted up. If Lily had family out there, Grace wanted to know. She did. Even if the thought of giving Lily up cut fissures in her heart. And that was exactly why she had to. She'd already allowed herself to become too attached. The last thing she wanted was to fall in love with another girl. Maybe she should have just left Lily on Cassidy's doorstep and run. She'd considered the option many times in the months since they'd escaped from Myron. Each time, Grace had talked herself out of it, certain that, because of what she knew, she would be better able to protect her. And sweet Lily needed somebody to fight for her, even if Grace, damaged and incapable as she was, happened to be the only option. Beside her, Andrew said, "Text that to me, would you?" When he hung up, he opened the photo she'd seen earlier again. He tapped the child's image. Photo was published in a newspaper in a small town in Texas. It went with an article about a county fair and rodeo. The woman is Annabeth Springer. According to the newspaper article, she's Lillian's mother. Lillian. Grace took a closer look. The woman looked young, late teens or early 20s. Thin and beautiful, with light hair and a big smile. A text lit up on the screen, and she handed the phone back to Andrew, who clicked it, then handed the phone back. The article. Grace perused it. Written 7 years prior, it talked about the fair, which had games and rides and food trucks galore. The author seemed proud that his little town had attracted a crowd of thousands. She enlarged the photo and read out loud the caption beneath. Annabeth Springer with daughter, Lillian, enjoying the festivities. She handed the phone back to Andrew. Annabeth didn't like Texas. His eyebrows lifted. Let me guess, one of your weird but accurate feelings? Not this time. Lily told me she liked Texas, but her mother hated it. That explains why you mentioned Texas earlier. I was beginning to think you were psychic. She'd been called exactly that more times than she cared to admit. Mama Lucy had always corrected the girls, saying Grace was gifted. She'd amended the statement in the years since Celia died. Cursed. Lily told me about her grandmother, who apparently smells like fried chicken and peaches. Delicious memory. Grace wished she knew more. She needed to pass Lily off to somebody who could love her properly, somebody who could hold her hand without losing her mind. It wasn't fear of Myron that kept her from wanting to keep Lily. Well, it wasn't only fear of Myron, though she wasn't a fool. The man was obviously dangerous. No. Her fears went much deeper than that, all the way back to Celia, her tears streaming down her cheeks, despondent look in her eyes. "It ain't your fault," she'd said. "Ain't nobody was ever gonna help me." Andrew gripped her shoulders, and she blinked away the memory. "You okay?" Yeah, I'm fine." As Andrew studied her, she was thankful to be standing in his shadow, knowing he wouldn't be able to see the expression on her face, because she didn't have the energy to hide it. She needed a moment to regroup. He watched her another few seconds, then faced the kids again. The sparklers were dying, one by one, but the kids didn't seem to care. They'd started a game of tag. Lily was it, chasing down a taller girl Grace hadn't met. She caught up to her, tagged her, and then bolted away, giggling all the while. Andrew's hand slid around Grace's back again. "David got an address for a family named Springer in Freedom Hills, Texas. It's about an hour outside of Austin. Your facial recognition guy is also a detective. He did a little digging. He's a good guy. How much are you paying him?" Andrew shrugged, gaze flicking to hers. "I wasn't going to tell you because I figured you couldn't afford to hire him. I'll pay you back. Can we trust him?" "What do you have to hide? You're not the one breaking the law. You're just trying to keep Lily safe. We're using false documents. You can trust him. You can trust me." She hoped that was true, prayed it was true. "Since money is apparently no object," Andrew said, "how about we fly out tomorrow, learn what we can?" She stepped away, missing the warmth of Andrew's arm on her back, but needing to think. "We can't do that. Those papers, remember? I don't know that they'll get us on a plane. But you could use your real IDs, right? Surely her father doesn't have access to flight records. I don't know how that works, but I don't either." She latched onto his words. She thought the false papers she'd bought would hold up, but she wasn't willing to risk it. If they didn't, then those IDs would no longer be good. Assuming she wasn't taken into custody, she'd still need to buy new ones, which would mean relocating. It was one thing to risk it to leave the country, but when the plan was to return to the home she was building, "I think we need to do it," Andrew said. "I've got a work thing next weekend, and I'd hate to wait 2 weeks. But if we left tomorrow, got back Monday, we'd only miss 1 day of work and school. I have the time off, and how much could Lily miss in 1 day?" Before Grace could respond, a booming voice came from behind her. "Where are you going?" She turned to see Andrew's father approaching, holding something under his arm. "Sorry, didn't mean to startle you." He held the something out, a notebook. "This just got here. Should be everything. If it's not, call me, not your brother." Andrew took it. "Thanks. Hopefully once I input these numbers, I'll get a sense of the big picture. The sooner the better. Ridiculous how long this has taken." He turned to Grace. "Taking a trip together?" "Nothing like that." Andrew answered before she could, and though his words were spoken kindly enough, she heard the hint of impatience in them. "Grace is trying to locate Lily's extended family." Grace winced, fearing the questions Andrew's words would garner, but Drew asked none of them. "If you're only going to be gone until Monday, you can take the jet." Andrew's face registered surprise. "Actually, Dad, that would be great." He turned to her. "I mean, if it's okay with you, it does solve some problems." A private jet. Her stepfather had been wealthy, but not private jet wealthy. Drew chuckled, apparently reading her expression. "We have offices all over the country. When you figure in the amount of time we don't waste going through security and dealing with layovers and canceled flights, it's actually pretty cost-effective." "I don't want to be any trouble," Grace said. "No trouble at all. I'm glad to be able to help." He turned to Andrew. "Get Alice the details, and she'll contact the crew." "Okay, I'll do that. Thanks, Dad. It means a lot." Drew cleared his throat. "Happy to. Least I can do." When he wandered away, Grace leaned close to Andrew. "He's a very nice man, isn't he?" Sometimes that gets lost in all the family drama. But yeah, he can be. She followed the older Middleton's trek across the grass. Andrew looked nothing like his father, who was shorter and rounder and had a lot less hair. There was tension between them, but even still, she saw the resemblance, not in their looks, but in their kindness. She looked up to the man at her side. "All you're doing for Lily and me. I don't know how to thank you. I'd sure like to hold your hand one of these days." The thought didn't bring the tension she might have expected. The one time she'd touched Andrew's hand, she'd only felt comfortable. But she didn't want to pry into his past without his permission. And to get that, she'd have to tell him the truth.
Chapter 17. Myron stared through the binoculars from his spot in the woods surrounding the condominium complex, his blood pressure rising by the moment. What was Grace doing up so early on a Sunday morning? She couldn't have discovered him. He'd kept himself carefully hidden. But if, on the off chance, she had, was Grace about to run again? The notion brought a flash of anger. Everything he'd done to prepare this place for her, and she was about to throw it all away. He'd thought for sure she was settling in to stay this time, the rented condo instead of the cheap hotel, the way she'd gotten to know the neighbors. Myron had no idea where she'd gone with the man, Andrew Middleton, the day before. When they'd started spending time together, Myron had learned his name. It had been late the night before by the time Middleton's BMW had parked in front of the condo across the lot from Grace's. While Grace unlocked the front door, he took the sleeping child in his arms and carried her inside, closing the door behind him. His Lily, so comfortable in the arms of another man. Grace would pay for that. She was getting far too close to Andrew Middleton. Meanwhile, everything was taking longer than Myron had hoped, and the more he delayed, the more difficult it would be to take Lily and Grace and disappear unnoticed. Even if nobody else did, Middleton was sure to miss them, and he'd raise the alarm which would set law enforcement looking for them, which was the last thing Myron needed. Why had Grace chosen this town? Of all the possibilities, why Coventry, New Hampshire? There had to be a reason. He just hadn't figured it out yet. He would, though. It was only a matter of time. He needed all the information he could get if he wanted to whisk the girls away without being caught. The house he'd procured needed more structural work than he'd thought it would, and contractors were hard to come by up here in the middle of nowhere. Myron would do the work himself, but hiring people, getting to know them, while keeping them at a safe distance, was a great way to prove he belonged in the community. By the time he brought his girls home, he would be well known and well respected. Nobody would suspect him of a thing. But considering that Grace was readying to leave so early on a Sunday morning, something was definitely wrong. Rather than work on building out the basement rooms and installing the cameras, it looked like Myron would have to figure out what Grace was up to. It would put off the work for one day, but even with that, the place should be ready soon. And then their lives would start over. With Lily and Grace where they belonged, Myron would capture beauty like he never had before.
Chapter 18. It was after 3 the following afternoon, by the time they exited the 6-lane highway onto a 2-lane country road about an hour outside of Austin, Texas. Grace had been shocked when they'd first stepped off the private jet onto the tarmac. It was October, but the temperature hovered in the mid-80s, the air heavy with humidity. Was this a normal autumn day in Texas? Despite the short night of sleep, Lily had been her usual chatterbox on the flight and when they'd driven through the city. Now she was quiet. Grace turned to watch her reaction in the back seat, while Andrew followed the directions on his phone. The child's eyes were wide as she gazed out the window at the passing landscape. The world was flatter here than in New Hampshire, but not as flat as Grace had expected. When they crested a hill and got a miles-long view, Andrew quipped, "There's a reason they don't call it mountain country." He wasn't wrong. The landscape was dotted with short, scrubby trees that covered low, rounded hills. This so-called hill country was nothing like what she'd grown up with in Washington, and paled in comparison to New Hampshire's White Mountains. Though it wasn't very green, there was a rugged beauty that brought to mind the pioneers, farmers, and ranchers who'd battled the heat and tamed the land. Grace kept her voice low, hoping not to pull Lily too much from the view outside. "Does anything look familiar?" Her narrow shoulders lifted and fell. Poor child was exhausted. She'd fallen asleep on the ride back to Coventry the night before, but had woken up when they got to the condo. It'd taken Grace a half hour to get her back to sleep. And then, she'd had to wake her at 7 for the flight. Though Grace was rarely impressed by wealth, flying in a private jet was nothing like flying commercial. The plane was tiny but well equipped with extra-wide seats and plenty of legroom. She and Lily had sat across from Andrew, a table between them. Lily colored and Andrew transferred numbers from the notebook he'd been given the night before into accounting software on his laptop. Grace had read her Bible and then prayed for the day, that the Lord would lead and direct them. The galley in the back had been stocked with breakfast pastries and boxed lunches, sodas, bottles of water, and a carafe of hot coffee, so that when they arrived in Austin, they didn't have to waste time getting lunch. Andrew navigated through the small downtown area with its charming storefronts pressed together, like boxes in a pantry, and looking like a scene out of an old Western movie. One corner held a mechanic's shop, where classic cars in various stages of repair were lined up in the lot. He made a few turns. They passed what looked like a new neighborhood, 2-story brick houses side by side with matching garages and driveways. But when he clicked on his blinker, he turned not into a neighborhood, but onto a narrow drive that led to a small house built of gray rocks. In the back seat, Lily gasped. "Have you been here before?" Grace asked. The child nodded. Andrew parked. Before he turned the car off, Lily climbed out and walked toward the front door slowly. Grace caught up with her there, studying the child while she gazed at the little rock house. It looked abandoned. No cars in the drive. Overgrown landscaping. The grass had been mowed, but not recently. The windows were cloudy. She didn't think Lily was seeing any of the disrepair. "What do you remember?" Grace asked. Rather than answering, Lily walked up the front steps and tried to turn the knob. "Sweetie, I don't think anyone's home. Even if they are, you have to knock." Lily looked up at Grace as if she'd forgotten she was there. "This is Nana's house." Grace wasn't sure if the knot in her stomach was a result of hope or dread. If Myron had reported Lily missing, then would the authorities have found Lily's extended family? Would Nana call the police the instant she saw Lily on her doorstep? Was Grace about to be hauled off to jail? Was Andrew? She should have thought this through. All of it. Yet, she had prayed about it, and this had felt like the best next move. If she could return the child to family, even if it meant the loss of her freedom, it would be worth it. And Andrew wouldn't be in trouble. He didn't know the truth about Grace and Lily. It would be all right. She had to trust that, whatever happened next, it would be all right. Andrew approached and stood at the bottom of the 3 steps leading to the stoop. After a deep breath for courage, Grace pointed to the doorbell. "You want to ring it?" Lily pushed the button, and the ding carried through the door. Nobody answered, no sounds from within to indicate anybody was home. Lily rang the bell again. Grace stood beside her, not wanting to rush the child. Andrew approached one of the windows, stood on tiptoe, and peered inside. He looked over his shoulder at Grace and shook his head. The place must be empty. "What was it like the last time you were here?" Grace hoped the open-ended question would stir Lily's memories. She finally pulled her focus from the door that hadn't opened and stepped back to the grass. Slowly, she walked towards the side of the house. "There's a peach tree in the backyard." "Will you show me?" Lily led the way. A chain-link fence surrounded the backyard. Andrew opened the gate, and they walked through. Sure enough, a short tree's overgrown limbs practically touched the ground. Stopping in the middle of the area that was more dirt than grass, Lily spun slowly, then pointed to the opposite corner. "There was a swing set there. Mama used to push me on the swing, And we had one of those horsey things you could get on with another person. Did you ever ride it with anyone? She shrugged. I think. A girl, maybe. Friend? A cousin? Without answering, Lily walked toward where she'd played as a little girl. Or maybe she'd been a toddler. Most of the shrubs in the back were dead, but the fence was lined with some sort of green plant that seemed to be thriving. Andrew stepped to Grace's side and watched the child wander around the space. When she returned, tears streamed down her face. I wish Nana was here. Grace crouched down and opened her arms. Oh, baby, I do too. Where is she? I don't know. Grace swallowed a lump, praying the woman was still alive, praying they'd be able to locate her. We'll try to find her, I promise. Lily held on to Grace's neck, as if she feared somebody was about to rip her away. What had happened to separate Lily from the family who'd lived here? Why weren't the Springers in the child's life? Were they looking for her? Did they care? When it seemed clear that Lily wasn't going to let go, Grace lifted her and settled her on her hip. She was a little big to be held that way, but Grace wouldn't complain. She loved the feel of Lily in her arms. Beside her, Andrew was scrolling on his phone. How could he do that in such a moment? What could possibly pull his attention away from this heartbroken child? Then, he looked up and settled his hand on Lily's back. Can I show you something? Grace felt the nod against her neck. Andrew pointed to the plants at the fence line. Those are flowers. They aren't in bloom right now, but when they are, they're beautiful. Lily lifted her head from Grace's shoulder and peered at the plants. Andrew lifted his phone. Here's what they look like when they're blooming. Grace and Lily both gazed at his screen to see an explosion of bright orange flowers. Pretty, Lily said. You know what's so cool about those flowers? Even when nobody takes care of them, even when nobody prunes them or waters them or does anything for them, they grow. Look around. He lifted his arm to indicate the rest of the rundown yard. Everything else is dead or dying, but not those. They're thriving. Grace's eyes filled with tears. She knew where he was going with this, and she loved him for it. You know what kinds of flowers those are? Huh-uh. What kind? They're lilies. Her eyes widened. Like me? Just like you, Lily, Andrew said. No matter how hard life is, lilies grow strong and beautiful. Lily squirmed, and Grace set her on her feet. She ran to the plants to investigate while Grace swiped the tears from her eyes. You're a pretty amazing man, Andrew Middleton. That was 100% God, he said. I don't know a daylily from a dandelion, but the word popped into my head. He could brush it off all he wanted, but she was impressed. Even if God had given him the information, Andrew had run with it. He'd used it to plant another seed of truth in Lily's heart. After this latest disappointment, Grace prayed it would take root. They were just climbing into their rental car when an SUV pulled into the driveway and parked behind them. A woman climbed out. Hey there, she called. Grace stepped away from the sedan. Hi. I live next door. The woman pointed toward a copse of oaks and a house beyond it. What are y'all doing here? Before she could answer, Lily said, I used to live here with my Nana. Do you know where she is? The woman smiled at Lily, but shook her head. I'm sorry, I don't. We moved here about a year ago, and this house has been empty the whole time. Real estate records say the Springers still own the house. Andrew stepped forward. You ever heard of that family? I wish I could help you. You ought to go see Ruby Lind. She lives on the other side of me. She's been here since statehood, I think. The woman smiled with the words, Just go on past the brick ranch. That's my house. Ruby lives in the White House on the same side. She knows everything about everybody. We'll do that, Grace said. Thanks. The woman climbed back into her oversized car and pulled away. When she was gone, Andrew said, Guess we're going to see Ruby Lind. 2 minutes later, they parked in front of a white house that looked even older than the stone one they'd just left. A wide front porch wrapped around it in both directions. This house's landscaping was well tended, the house freshly painted. The lack of cars in the driveway, There was no garage, didn't bode well. "Sit tight," he said. "I'll go knock." When nobody opened at Andrew's knock, Grace pulled a piece of paper from her purse and penned a note, asking Ms. Lynn to please call her as soon as possible. She turned to Lily, who was staring back in the direction of the rock house, though it was out of sight from where they sat. "Stay here. I'll be right back." Worry niggled at Grace as she exited the car. Had it been a mistake to bring Lily on this trip? She could have left her with Cassidy, but with the threat of Myron, she'd been nervous for both Lily's sake and Cassidy's. But had bringing Lily raised hopes in the child? Hopes that would be in vain? Grace prayed not. Andrew turned as Grace climbed to the porch. "Nobody's home." "Figures." She held out the note. "Maybe we can stick it in the door?" He took it and left it wedged between the screen door and the jamb. "Assuming they use this entrance, they shouldn't miss it." He turned and reached for her hand, then pulled his back and shoved it in his pocket like that had been his plan all along. She wished she could hold hands like a normal person. "The library? Here's hoping we'll learn something." The library was housed in a one-story gray brick building with a porch that ran the length of the front. A giant brass star, surrounded by a circle, adorned the entry. The same star she'd seen 50 times already since they'd left the airport. Seemed Texans were pretty proud of that star. The outside of the library looked old and dingy, but inside it was new and modern. Lily, who'd never met a library she didn't like, picked out 2 books to read, while Andrew talked to the librarian about what they were looking for. When he gestured to Grace from the circulation desk, she ushered Lily toward him. "Come on, sweetie. You can read while Mr. Middleton and I try to get some information on your grandmother." The child settled into a cushy chair nearby, while the librarian, a tall, slender woman with gray hair, pulled up old newspaper articles and showed them how to search. When they were set, the woman said, "I'll go find those yearbooks while you look." After she walked away, Grace said, "Yearbooks? Thought it wouldn't hurt to see if we could find a better photo of Lily's mother. And maybe see if Myron is in any of them. I'd guess that he's significantly older than Annabeth." Andrew shrugged. "They have yearbooks going back a long time. If he's in them, we should find him." They searched the newspaper archives for the name Springer and found very few references. There was the article about the fair, with the photograph they'd already seen, and Annabeth's birth notice. She'd been born to Buck and Darla Springer. Grace did the math, figuring out how old Annabeth would be now. Sure enough, Lily's mother had only been 19 when Lily was born. There were no engagement or wedding announcements for Annabeth, but considering that she'd still had her parents' last name when Lily was a toddler, Grace wasn't surprised by that. They found Buck Springer's obituary. He died not long after Lily's birth. They didn't find an obituary for Lily's grandmother or Annabeth. After the article picturing Annabeth and Lily at the fair, the Springers were never mentioned again. "Not a lot there," Andrew said. The librarian left a pile of yearbooks on the table, and Grace found the one from the year before Lily was born. They were thin, indicating the size of the small high school. She skimmed past the younger grades, and then slowly flipped through the color photographs of the seniors. "There she is," Andrew said. Grace's gaze landed on the teenage Annabeth Springer. Grace could see Lily in the shape of the girl's nose and mouth, in the high cheekbones. Her skin was milky and clear, her eyes pale blue. She glanced at Lily, who was flipping through a picture book. Did the child get anything else from this woman? Her intelligence? Her kindness? Where was Annabeth now? How could she have left her daughter and never looked back? Or was there something else going on? Maybe she'd become addicted. Maybe she'd been mentally ill. Maybe she just didn't care. Andrew tugged the book closer and leaned over it, then glanced at Lily and back. "Wait." She tore her gaze away from the image to focus on Andrew, whose lips were pinched closed as he looked from the child to the photo. "What?" she said. He kept his voice low, practically whispering when he said, "You have that picture of Myron?" She opened her phone and found it. She'd taken a screenshot of his portrait from his website. In the picture, Myron was younger by a decade than the man she'd met. Mid-30s, blonde hair, blue eyes, handsome. Andrew studied the photo, then studied the picture of Annabeth. What? Grace couldn't figure out what he was seeing that she was missing. Still with his voice low, he said, Lily has brown hair and green eyes. Yeah, and... But she saw what he'd noticed. Both Myron and Annabeth were blonde-haired and blue-eyed. The chances of that are astronomically low, Andrew said. The hair color, maybe, but two blue-eyed parents having a green-eyed kid? He shook his head. And when you figure in both of those, the hair and the eyes? Again, he studied the two photographs and the little girl sitting not 5 feet away. It's a statistical impossibility. You're saying it's impossible that they're her parents? Because she looks like her mother. Didn't you notice? I'm saying it's impossible that they're both her parents, he said. I agree she favors her mother. Which means Myron Bowman is not her biological father. Could it be true? Had Lily been kidnapped? If so, why hadn't the image search turned up her picture in more places? Surely, if she'd been kidnapped, photographs of her would have been distributed to law enforcement. Amber alerts would have gone out. A photo of a missing child would be on the internet, somewhere, wouldn't it? But no such photo existed. Andrew said, maybe he's her stepfather. And then Annabeth just left her with him? A little girl with a man? Andrew swiveled to face her. Maybe she didn't know what kind of a person Myron was. She trusted him to take care of her? How could she? How could any woman leave any daughter with any man? The question must have shown on her face, because Andrew, in that low, gentle voice she was coming to love, said, Some of us can be trusted, you know. He was right, of course. Between her own history, her work in the girls' home, and her so-called gift, she'd had too much experience with evil men. It was easy to forget they weren't all that way. Andrew wasn't. She slid her fingers over his wrist on the armrest. I know, you're right, but to take the risk, however low it might have been, what kind of mother would do that? Maybe she had no choice. Lily was still engrossed in her book, but Grace lowered her voice anyway. She said Myron told her that Annabeth left because Lily was too much trouble. Andrew's jaw dropped a moment before his lips pressed together. It wasn't that he had nothing to say. She could see the effort he expended to not voice what he was thinking. She flipped through the yearbook, searching for other photos of Annabeth. Skimming the names beneath the group photos, she found no mention of Lily's mother. The teenager hadn't been involved in band, any of the clubs, or any of the sports teams. She didn't participate in the school plays or sing in the choir. She wasn't pictured in the homecoming dance or the prom spreads. In a careful study of snapshots, she found one other photo of Annabeth. In the foreground, two cheerleaders in uniform had their cheeks pressed together, giant grins on their faces. In the background, Annabeth was sitting alone, hunched over a book, long, lanky legs bent and crossed at the ankles. She'd glanced toward the camera, but wasn't smiling. She was gorgeous. Perhaps she'd been shy. Or perhaps that photograph didn't accurately depict the teenage Annabeth. Maybe she'd had lots of friends, but somehow never got caught in photos. After searching for Myron Bowman, no mention of anybody with his last name, she set the book aside. While Andrew returned his attention to the library computer, Grace flipped through the previous yearbooks. She located Annabeth's image among the students' portraits in each of her grades, but found no other images of her. It seemed that she'd managed to attend 4 years of high school without ever joining anything, without making any mark whatsoever. Considering her graduating class had fewer than 100 people, that was almost impressive. She glanced at yearbooks going back to a decade before Annabeth started high school, but found no mention of Myron or any other Bowmans. Beside her, Andrew pushed back his chair and shook his head. There's no record of a Bowman family owning property in Freedom Hills. No mention of him in the newspaper. I didn't find him in the yearbooks either. So he wasn't from here. How in the world did he meet Annabeth? No idea. This tiny town, an hour from Austin. She opened Annabeth's senior yearbook and found her image again. She really was beautiful, shockingly beautiful. Myron's a photographer. I wonder if he ever took her picture. Maybe she wanted to be a model, he said. Grace found the photo where Annabeth was caught in the background. He looked at the image. She was tall and slim. A model's body, Grace said. They said nothing, just gazed at the girl in the photo, who looked so much like the one seated just a few feet away. Aside from the hair and eye color, Lily was a younger version of her mother. Would she grow up with that same willowy body? With those same drop-dead good looks? A target for evil men? Not Lily. Grace would die before she let the girl be exploited again. Misunderstanding her shudder, Andrew slipped his arm around her back and rubbed her shoulder. I swear, indoors in the South is colder than winter in New Hampshire. Grace's chill had nothing to do with the air conditioner.